Being a beginner in nature photography is like a journey through a minefield of misconceptions and all sorts of misleading paths down which you might end up wasting a lot of time. Of course, everybody has to learn with their own mistakes. Everybody has to go through their own journey. But I think there are some mistakes which are best avoided in the interest of saving time. So here's a list of the commonest mistakes that I see beginners in nature photography making and how to avoid them. I'll start with equipment because I think photography is the only art form in which the tools we use are given equal or perhaps even more importance than the content or the art itself that we are making. This is completely understandable, of course, because we love toys and we love technology. We love to have new things with us all the time, and therefore the aspiration to have the most advanced, latest and greatest camera or DSLR or mirrorless is always quite compelling. But I strongly recommend you try to avoid that. Don't fall into that trap. Try to focus on the process of image making. So I think usually the cycle goes something like this. We start off having an eye for photography, which is what tells us that we're interested in this field of pursuit. So we actually tend to make very interesting compositions, capture moments, and focus on the everyday things around us, and which is how we get into it in the first place. But unfortunately, somewhere down the line, we get sucked into this whirlpool of equipment obsession and completely lose sight of why we started photography in the first place. One of the inherent strengths of a DSLR or mirrorless interchangeable camera is its interchangeability, lens interchangeability. It allows you the flexibility to use the kind of lens that you need to use and want to use for a particular application, whether it's a macro lens or an ultra wide angle lens or a telephoto lens, a fisheye lens, a tilt shift lens, what have you. So prioritizing the body over the lens is actually missing the point completely, because any camera these days, virtually, you name it, is capable of making very good pictures. I mean, there's enough resolution, there's enough dynamic range, there's enough chromatic brilliance, there's enough noiselessness. So you really don't have to fret so much over which camera body you buy, but you certainly must pay a lot of attention to which lens you buy with it, because that is going to have a huge bearing on the kind of perspectives and ultimately images that you manage to make. You can make a good photograph outstanding with the proper, tasteful, imaginative, bold processing decisions, but you cannot salvage a bad photograph. And what do I mean by a bad photograph? A bad photograph is simply one which deviates from how you want it to be by, say, more than 20 or 30%. So for example, let's say you wanted a sharp picture, a pin sharp picture where the subject is absolutely sharp, and it has motion blur because it was moving and you did not use a fast enough shutter speed, and so you got motion blur on the subject. Now that is a bad photograph because it deviates from your intended photograph and it cannot be fixed. So you really need to understand the limitations of processing and have realistic expectations from it. Ideally look at it as something that you will be polishing your image with and not making your image with, and just restrict yourself to expecting to do only the last 5 or 10%, the last mile in Photoshop or Lightroom or whichever software application you prefer to use, and do not ever start an image thinking or on the basis of the assumption that you will make the software application make your image. This amuses me more than anything else because it's such a laughably off the mark belief that you have to be in the manual mode if you're a real photographer. In fact, I've even seen a t-shirt which was being advertised on Instagram, if I'm not wrong, which said everybody is a photographer until, and then there was the logo of the manual mode. In the manual mode, you need to set all the 3 parameters which determine your exposure, namely the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And the problem is that you and I have absolutely no clue as mere mortal human beings as to what the correct combination is. for every time you point your camera at something. We don't know, that is the fact. So instead, if you rely on the camera to tell you what the ideal exposure should be by shifting into these semi-automatic modes, then you're doing it scientifically, because the camera actually has an inbuilt reflective light meter which measures the light being reflected off the subject that you're pointing at, and then calculates as per the algorithms built into it by the engineers who designed the camera based on thousands and thousands of situations as to what the correct combination should be. And of course, you can and should apply the last manual refinement, fine-tune the exposure decision that the camera has arrived at to get it exactly the way you want. But you do not start in the manual mode determining all the three things, because you do not really know what the correct combination should be unless you use an external incident light meter. So please do not be under this impression that you are obligated to use the manual mode just because you have a DSLR or just because you want to be a serious photographer. Firstly, don't be serious at all about photography. Like with anything else that you love doing, it will work best if you enjoy doing it and not be very dead serious about it. The last item I have on this list is the impression that a lot of people have that you need a lot of money to travel to be a good nature and wildlife photographer. So that is true if your main focus is wild mammals and maybe even birds to some extent, exotic migratory birds or birds from different parts of your country, etc. But it's certainly not true if you're talking about nature and wildlife in general, because no matter where you live, I'm sure that there is some wildlife that you can find in your backyard or not very far away from your home, because the definition of wildlife is not just mammals and birds. It also includes reptilians, amphibians, and insects, and all sorts of invertebrates. Some of you may even be fortunate to have your own garden, and there is an immense amount of time you can spend there photographing just the leaves, the branches, the flowers, the buds, and of course the grasshoppers, the frogs, the toads. So there is always something you can find to photograph, and in fact I think these situations give you far more freedom and ability to be creative, an opportunity to express yourself, than a mammal in a national park or a bird somewhere on a branch, because those depend a lot more on fortune. They need to cooperate with your expectations. So my advice would be to not count on only travel to exotic national parks and faraway wildernesses. Just look for something right in your backyard and start with it. I'm sure that will give you a lot more opportunity as well as experience in creative photography, which ultimately is what it's about, because there may be millions and millions of pictures of the very same subject, but still the way you look at it could be different, and these sorts of backyard subjects give you the opportunity to do something with them. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Of course, if you've come across a common mistake that you've seen newbie photographers make, or if you're a newbie photographer yourself and have questions about something and need guidance, do feel free to comment and I'll certainly reply. Meanwhile, thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video again. Goodbye.